Not the 2020 music, but we are entering the home stretch with the Iowa caucuses now just 35 days away. And now Democrats are having something of a spending spat. The Washington Post outlined the proposals of the major candidates, and the paper's analysis shows a major divide in what they want to spend. The Post says Bernie Sanders' agenda would cost $50 trillion over 10 years. That includes things like Medicare for all, forgiving college loan debt, the Green New Deal, and more. The other top progressive in the race, Elizabeth Warren, would spend more than $20 trillion for universal health care alone. But candidates running in the moderate lane, the Bidens, Buttigieg's, and Amy Klobuchar's, have all been critical of the planned spending splurges by their competitors on their left. And joining me now to discuss, Democratic strategist Max Burns. Max, with about a month to go before the Iowa caucuses, Democratic policies and their costs are in the spotlight today. The Washington Post focusing in on trillions of dollars worth of proposed spending by Democratic candidates. Now, much of that is on policies they're headlining their campaigns with. Healthcare obviously getting the most attention, but also education, childcare, and a lot more. These issues are being viewed, and the spending levels are being viewed either as a question mark or a negative by most of the media. How are voters responding to it, as a positive or a negative, primary voters?
I believe what you're starting to see here is what Republicans have known for years, which is that spending does not matter to voters. We've seen Republican policies for tax cuts for the wealthy, bailouts of farmers due to President Trump's trade war. And so far, there's been no real indication that voters are interested in punishing anyone for that. If anything, Democrats pushing forward spending policies on things like health care, student loans, will actually see the support of most voters because for once people are spending money on them instead of just this top 1% of America.
But it does seem like something of an imbalance in the coverage, Max, where the Democrats' spending plans are under the microscope and it's really impacting people's campaigns, Elizabeth Warren particularly when it comes to health care. Very little focus on the president's record when it comes to the economy and a deficit that's going to hit $1 trillion next year.
Absolutely. And it's sort of ridiculous to see Donald Trump as a candidate said that he would end the deficit and end the national debt in his first term, criticized President Obama's spending. But President Trump has spent about 30% more than President Obama at this point in his presidency. And that's money, as I said earlier, that's gone largely to people who are a lot like Donald Trump, very wealthy individuals, business owners. Well, we've seen benefits for the middle class and working class cut. And that's something that I think voters are starting to realize is that the largesse of the government is not very balanced in favor of the people who most need the help.
Back to the Democrats, the questions about policies and their costs really speaks to the divide within the party between the progressive and the establishment center left, those two movements. To your mind, is that still the biggest unresolved question for Democrats as 2020 opens? Are you seeing any signs that either wing is gaining momentum, or should we be focusing more on individual candidates than we do on their lanes?
So the million-dollar question there is, will the momentum that we've seen from people like Pete Buttigieg hold into Iowa? We're still a little over a month away. And it's a sign that things are very evenly divided. There hasn't been a lot of change in the polling in the last few months. We've seen people make news stories out of a 2 or 3% shift in national polling, which indicates that voters either are not paying a lot of attention or that they have their candidates. And what's interesting on the progressive side of that is that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren combined have a majority of the popular vote nationally and in most of the states. The problem is they're splitting this progressive vote, which is giving Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg an opportunity to really divide and conquer there. So it'll be interesting to see if there's a push for the progressive wing to sort of consolidate behind one candidate.
Maybe the biggest issue for Democrats in 2020. Another issue-specific report out from the Times today focusing on the economic argument from Democrats that the top-line economy, yeah, it's doing well, the stock markets, employment levels, that sort of thing. But Democrats are trying to preach that those gains aren't reaching the working class or the middle class. Polls certainly suggest that voters think the economy is doing well, and Trump is already countering with, if you vote me out, you're going to lose money. How difficult a sell is that Democratic argument on the economy going to be? Yeah, the big ticket looks good, but how's it impacting you specifically?
Well, Trump may say things will get worse, but I don't think farmers in states like Iowa and Ohio that he needs to win are buying that. They've seen their prices for crops cut in half. A lot of them now are in serious financial peril because of the president's trade war. And we've seen Democrats, especially Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, making a really strong case that the gains in this economy are not evenly divided. That same president who pledged to bring back coal has presided over some of the largest losses in coal and industrial jobs in the last 25 years. So it may be a good game for President Trump to talk like this is a success, but middle class and working class voters who have seen stagnant paychecks, well, the top 1% and 10% have gone up almost 250% in net worth under Trump. You're not going to be able to tell people they have money that they can't see.
I want to focus in on a group of voters that could be essential to Democrats' chances in 2020, young voters. And you, I note, are a senior columnist in Millennial Politics. The numbers look good for Democrats among younger voters in terms of enthusiasm and interest level, but there are also big levels of support for Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, both of whom could be considered movement candidates and who most experts might consider less likely potential nominees. Read the tea leaves for me. Are young voters in for the long haul in 2020, or is it the story we've seen before? If their candidates go, their support will also wane?
I think the young voters are here to stay. We saw in 2018, for the first time in history, that millennial and Gen X voters actually outvoted baby boomers and the silent generation. That's the first time that's ever happened. And it's a huge reason why Democrats in 2018 took the House back. Those young voters are unabashedly progressive, and they believe in candidates that want to shake things up. And that's actually led to, I think, a lot of candidates coming around to these young voters and actually taking seriously movements like the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas gun safety protests and the Women's March, and these things that have largely been successful because of the voices of young people and their activism.
Same question with voters of color. It's looking less and less likely as we go on that the party's likely to be represented by a Democratic presidential nominee of color. How important is having a person of color on the ticket to turn out, and is the party engaged in efforts that may actually bear fruit to make sure that voters of color turn out this November?
Yeah, and I'm somewhat surprised, honestly, at just how quickly these debates have become affairs largely for white, older, male candidates. And I think the party's starting to notice that there's a problem there, that our candidates don't look like the base. And when you have candidates like Pete Buttigieg, who's struggling to get really any African American support, and candidates like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, who unfortunately dropped out recently due to lack of traction, it's tough to bridge that gap between what the base says they want and who they're giving money to. Because you follow the money, that's going to Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, and they're all struggling in their own way with African American voters. So my hope is that we'll see some sort of consensus to bring in more diversity and more representation on the ticket.
And I suspect America will get to know Stacey Abrams in a way that perhaps a lot of Americans don't by the end of 2020. Finally, it's the end of the year. It's a good time for predictions. So I'm going to ask you, right now, what do you think would be the three most likely Democratic tickets come the convention?
I think any ticket is going to look really seriously at Kamala Harris as a vice president, also at Julian Castro and Stacey Abrams as a vice president, as you mentioned. Especially if it's someone from the center like Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden. If you have Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, all bets are off. You may end up with someone we haven't even heard of before that excites the base, and that would be its own sort of rejuvenation of the party. But right now it's looking like it will be sort of a moderate centrist at the top of the ticket, and most likely a woman of color as vice president, not only for that diversity, but because of the wealth of experience those candidates I mentioned bring that someone like Joe Biden desperately would need.
What's the more likely balancing act, balancing progressive versus mainstream, or balancing gender and ethnicity and race?
Well, the party's really changed in that sense. It's very much more about identity politics right now. And you're going to need someone, if there's a Pete Buttigieg or anyone who is skeptical of Medicare for all or student loan forgiveness, to have someone who ideologically satisfies young voters, the minority base, women voters who have largely felt excluded in the past. And that's going to be a challenge for anybody to convince a progressive to essentially compromise and join a moderate ticket.
Max Burns is a Democratic strategist. Max, thank you very much. Happy New Year. Appreciate it.
Happy New Year. Thank you.
Up next, all right, we're on the eve of a holiday, so we're going to lighten things up and head to the movies. A former president of Marvel joins us to take a look at the state of the movie business as streaming gets more and more popular.